Hi there, and welcome to our webinar, Making Your Website Accessible to People with Disabilities. I'm Justin Thorpe, Marketing Manager for Advocacy. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. We're recording this webinar, and we'll send out links to the recording and slides. Please submit your questions in the Zoom console at the top of your screen. For those of you not familiar with Advocacy, we help you attract and engage your web and mobile visitors with smart, beautiful marketing tools powered by extraordinary interest-based behavioral data. You've likely seen our share buttons, which are on over 15 million websites. But on to today's talk. Sharon is the Executive Director of leading accessibility advocacy nonprofit Nobility and the co-chair of the Education and Outreach Working Group for the World Wide Web Consortium's Web Accessibility Initiative. That's a mouthful, but what that means is that she's an expert in what she's about to tell you. For today's talk, Sharon will talk about the importance of making sure your website's universally accessible, including to people with disabilities. She'll give some practical tips for how you get started. And now, Sharon, over to you.
Thanks so much. This is a great opportunity. I'm really happy to be here and happy that all of you are joining us, and hopefully I'll be able to give you some quick tips to get started in web accessibility. I know often people are intimidated by the idea of web accessibility, and my hope is that we can cool some of that fear and give you some good tools. Take just a quick snapshot of web accessibility, what it is, why it matters to people. I'd like to help you identify some essential techniques, answer any questions you might have, and give you some pointers to what's next to build an accessibility practice. Justin already told you about me, so I don't need to add to that. We're based in Austin, Texas, nonprofit advocacy organization that helps make the web more accessible. And you know, the fact is that the web was originally designed, I mean, that was the whole idea of the World Wide Web, was to bring down barriers. And those are barriers in different platforms, operating systems, you know, the technology differences that sometimes separate us, formats, or using different browsers or devices. All of that is supposed to not matter. The web transcends all that. Transcends distance, language differences, and yes, disability. I think it was very appropriate that the founder of the World Wide Web, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, said that the power of the web is in that universality, and access by everyone regardless of disability is an essential aspect. So really what we're doing when we advocate for accessibility is bringing the web back to its true basic nature. And the people who help us do that are based at the W3C. The W3C is the global standards maker for the web. I mean, they tell us everything like what is valid HTML, CSS, SVG, all kinds of emerging technologies. That's really where it happens for global web standards. And all of their technical standards are respected around the globe, including their accessibility standards. So at the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative, which we often shorten to call WAY, you'll find web content accessibility guidelines, or WCAG, authoring tools accessibility guidelines, ATAG. You'll find guidelines for browsers and AT accessibility, and dynamic applications. And about this time, people start feeling like, whoa, I am overwhelmed. What are all these standards? What are all these specifications? How can I possibly manage all that? And I think it's understandable. I mean, when I look at the technical specifications, sometimes I feel overwhelmed. So I'm going to tell you today, don't even bother. Don't go there. Don't read the specifications. Use these other side doors into the material and think about what we're actually trying to achieve, which is that people with disabilities will be able to acquire the same information, participate in the same activities, and if you think about it, you know, nobody wants to just be a passive receptor on the web. The excitement of the web is in the participation, and so we want to make sure that people with disabilities are actively able to produce content and participate in social media in the same ways as all other users. So we have a number of reasons that help us, if you're the advocate in your organization or in your group, you may need to make different kinds of arguments to different kinds of people. And one of them is the legal argument. You know, it's increasingly around the world, it's the law. The UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities was passed several years ago. It explicitly says access to communications technology is a basic human right. And governments understand and are recognizing that. There are laws all over the globe that really support that. In the United States, we see the Department of Justice enforcing web accessibility laws under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I think that's something to really be aware of. The DOJ is very active in this right now. They are accepting complaints from people and imposing fines and doing investigations about it. So if your company or organization is motivated in that way, there's a great argument to be made there. There's also the technical argument, the fact that when you create accessible websites, you make your application or your website much more technically adept. You can adapt to mobile, tablets. I mean, that was one of the big surprises for some people when they had designed with accessibility in mind. Then when we all started using our mobile devices, it was like, oh, accessibility is already built in, because I was thinking about accessibility and I have a flexible, responsive design that can adapt to different output devices. There's also the market argument. So if you're in a business and they're looking for new markets, the market of people with disabilities is huge, and it's growing as the population ages. A few years ago, Fortune magazine put out a study, and I bet these numbers have grown by now, where they said in the United States, people with disabilities have an annual income of about $1 trillion, and their spending of that is about $200 billion in discretionary income. So that's a huge market that you probably don't want to ignore. And then there's the humanitarian reason. And I told you I'm from a nonprofit in Austin, Texas. That's the one that always resonates with me. This next screen is just a collage of people that I've known through the years who have used technology, use it in brilliant and innovative ways, and are all people with disabilities. And it's very, it's just kind of, you really understand the importance of good design when you see the uses that people with disabilities put it to. Just like any other group of users, they are brilliant, innovative, and need the same access as anyone else. So that tends to be my central focus. And in support of that, at the EOWG, the Education and Outreach Working Group that Justin mentioned earlier, we recently released these short videos. And I wanted to share these with you because as advocacy tools, they're really very useful and very powerful because they make the point about web accessibility in a very
Web
quickly.
accessibility perspectives. Keyboard compatibility. Not being able to use your computer because your mouse doesn't work is frustrating. Many people use only the keyboard to navigate websites, either through preference or circumstance. Whether it's temporarily limited mobility, a permanent physical disability, or simply a broken mouse, the result is the same. Websites and apps need to be operable by keyboard. Web accessibility. Essential for some, useful for all. Visit w3.org/WAI/perspectives for more information on keyboard compatibility.
And like I said, there are like 10 of these little short videos that illustrate different. I'm going to show you another one now because there are options in these videos to share them with captions, audio description, there are transcripts. So I'm going to use the audio described version of this one, and you can see how that one works.
Web accessibility perspectives. Text to speech.
A man is using a laptop with the text on the screen being highlighted as it is spoken.
Some people can see the text on the screen. Fortunately, computers can convert text to speech.
It's technology that many people who are blind have been relying on for years.
A service dog is next to the man. He may be blind.
But it's also important for many people with dyslexia.
A woman is reading on a tablet and listening with headphones.
and very useful for people with difficulty reading text.
A man removes his glasses and listens to a news article on a tablet.
As well as some people who just like to multitask.
A man listens to a magazine article as they do the washing.
But for this to work, websites and apps have to be properly coded.
A website is not properly working for the woman with headphones. She is frustrated.
Which has the added benefit of helping search engines index websites' contents better.
The man with the service dog is using his mobile device outside with bone conduction headphones. Different people from earlier are shown using text-to-speech.
Web accessibility, essential for some, useful for all.
So those, I definitely would encourage you guys to go look at those videos, and if they're helpful to you, use them within your organization as advocacy tools to help people understand what are these issues, and each one of them leads to additional information. Another way to approach it without having to dive into the guidelines, those scary guidelines, are to look at the principles of accessibility. Again, these are based on user experience, so they're very related to human beings and their experience in interacting with online information. So the 4 basic principles of web accessibility content is that content must be perceivable, however you perceive information, however you bring it. It must be operable, so I should be able to interact with it successfully. It should be understandable, in saying that I should have clear instructions and understanding of where I am in the pages and in the process. And it should be robust. Again, that idea that it can be flexible enough to be rendered on different kinds of devices, including assistive technologies. So some of the common barriers that I just wanted to briefly go through today and help people get an initial understanding of. Some of the most common barriers are these that are listed here: structure, reading order, keyboard, text alternatives, color and contrast, link text, and multimedia. And we're going to look at each one in a little more detail. The idea of structure is the fact that when I land on a page as a sighted user, I can see how the page is laid out. I can see what the main topic is, where the navigation is, if there's a footer. All of that stuff is very available to me as a sighted user. If you structure your content properly, that same information can be available to people who don't see it and who interact with assistive technologies. So the key there is to use the semantic structures as they've been defined, and not for just visual presentation. So you wouldn't say, oh, I want a headline here, I guess I'll make the text big and bold. No, you would choose a heading level that's logically nested and assign that. This is also very, very important when it comes to creating online forms, making sure that they are semantically associated, the ID, the form ID, with the label that tells the user what it's for and what information is needed there. And for all of this, there are links to more information about exactly how you do that. You also want to think about outlining your page structure with these HTML5 has regions or ARIA landmarks, or some other programmatic way that a screen reader can navigate and understand the information structure and relationships. Somewhat related to that is the idea of reading and focus order. The fact is that the default is that the reading order is just going to be the code order. The screen readers and other assistive technologies will navigate through in the order that that it appears in the code. So you want to keep that in mind also as you create a tab order, that you want your tab order to move top to bottom and left to right. If I'm a sighted user of assistive technology, that will be my expectation, that if I'm navigating with the keyboard, that's the order that I would go in. Since page titles are the very first thing that are read when you land, you want to make sure that your page titles uniquely describe the page content and give the user who doesn't see the page some idea of where they are and what to expect on that page. There are times where you have to let your user know that, here's an alert, here's a error message, here's something that you need to know about right now. In that case, you have to be sure to manage your focus properly, both moving the focus into the alert and also giving the user a way to close that and get back where they were on the page. So keyboard operation, we saw that short video. It's very important. You definitely want to make sure that everything's in your tab order and all functional elements can be reached and activated. But something that's often overlooked is the fact that it's equally as important for that keyboard focus to be clearly visible. So either use the same focus indication that you use with mouse hover, or sometimes even enhance it to the point where you put a 2-pixel boundary around it and make sure that it has sufficient contrast to be clearly visible. I think text alternatives are the one thing that people hear about first. Oh yeah, I need to put some text on my images. The devil is in the details there, though, because you definitely want to make sure that your alt text is appropriate. And the way to determine that is, if the image itself is conveying meaning. And I give this example of the box of chocolates because the place I encountered this was actually on a bank site that said you have choices when it comes to mortgage rates or mortgage options or mortgage packages. So this was a link, and to describe this as a box of chocolates would have been inaccurate in that case. So you have to think about this in context. And if, in fact, it was used just as a piece of decoration, I would have been fine to just put empty alt, where you open and close the quotes. That gives the screen reader permission to remain silent, and or you could also use CSS background. But in this case, since it was a target, or it was leading to a targeted page, you should identify that. So the alt text would have been something about those mortgage rates rather than, I wouldn't have cared about the box of chocolate at that point. It gets really tricky when you have complex images like charts and graphs, and so you need to really think about using some ARIA attributes or a long description or something like that. So I've made it more complicated, it seems, and that's why I often suggest that people go look at this alt decision tree that's on the WAY website that asks a series of questions, gives you some choices about how to create the alt text, and if you're not certain, it will actually link within the tutorial to some examples and code that will help you do that thing right. Color and contrast is another tricky thing. You want to avoid using color as the only way to say that something is necessary or some state. It's not that you shouldn't use color, it's just that you need something else. So if you look at this, it's fine to say required fields are in red. You just need to add another indicator that's not color dependent for people who have low vision or of color blindness, and there's many of those people. So you just add an underline or an asterisk, or definitely put required in the label of that form field. Also, contrast, the W3C has set some standards on that, and there are some very easy browser-based tools to measure. You want contrast of 4.5 to 1 or higher. Link text, click here doesn't work if you're using a screen reader and you're just browsing the links and you hear click here, click here, click here, and don't know click where and do what. So you want to specify where does the link go, what does it do, make sure that it makes some sense out of context without just saying read more, click here, etc. Now, some people really want that read more at the bottom of their paragraphs, and in that case, you can use an ARIA describe by to make the association that the screen reader will hear and not change your on-screen appearance. We looked at the media, those short videos from the W3C. This is another one that talks about captioning. Basic principles for media. Again, you want to remember your keyboard, making sure that all of this is keyboard operable. You want to make sure that you provide captions. You want to make sure that you also provide a text transcript even if you have captions. Providing a text transcript is always a great fallback. I think on the web you can remember that text is king. Everybody, every device can manage and make sense out of the text. Okay, so I've given you all these things. Say, do this, do this, do this. How do you know if you've done it right? And so one of the tools I love to recommend from the Education and Outreach Working Group is this Easy Checks from the W3C. And what it does is guide you through a process. You download some free browser-based testing tools, and then this will take you step by step through how do you test, how do you verify that you've done it right. And if I pass this test, can I say I'm W3C compliant or WCAG compliant? No, actually you can't, but you can get a lot of the low-hanging fruit. And that's the purpose of the Easy Checks, and also to get you more and more familiar with the issues. Because what happens on that site is that it leads you into more information, but you go slowly into that cold water. I also think it's also very helpful and useful to get information from your users. So include people with disabilities in any usability testing that you're doing. You can call local disability organizations, but you should be warned that sometimes people with disabilities get pretty tired of always being asked to test for free. So you can also do some remote testing and pay your users if in fact when you do usability testing you pay your non-disabled users. There are ways to recruit people with disabilities as well. This is another resource from the W3C way that I just think is very helpful for people to get started in accessibility according to your role. So if you're a designer, you would get these tips that say, here are some really quick tips. You notice there's no guidelines in sight. There's no technical specifications in sight. What there is coding techniques, more information if you want detail, and then some good, quick examples that help you to determine how to approach that particular barrier. Also, this is the shameless plug department from Nobility. We have community events that we hope really help people to understand and apply accessibility in a fun and interactive way. Our Accessibility Internet Rally is an accessible web design contest. It benefits global nonprofits, and we're recruiting teams and nonprofit participants right now. AccessWorks is the remote user testing where we will help you recruit people with disabilities to do remote usability testing and reporting. And then one that I hadn't mentioned yet was the AtStar program, which is a K-12 teacher training that helps teachers understand what assistive technology is and how to use it effectively in the classroom to improve educational outcomes for students with disabilities. And those are my slides. I'm happy to answer any questions. I hope I didn't use up too much time. Do we still have time for questions,
No,
Justin?
Absolutely, Sharon. That was fantastic. Yes, this is the time for questions. So please find the Q&A console inside of the Zoom interface. That'll either be at the top or bottom of your screen, and submit those questions now. We've got a couple queued up while people are doing that. Also, just as kind of a housekeeping note, we will be sending out these slides. We'll send out a recap. We'll send out the video to this presentation. So if you're seriously taking notes, don't worry. We will have all of this for you so that you can reference it later. But yes, this is the time for questions. We'd love to get through as many as possible. What an incredible opportunity to get your questions answered by someone who is a leading expert in the field. So to start out, we have Eric. Eric asks, I'm still a bit dodgy on the legal requirements. That's the primary reason why my clients are asking about it. They're afraid they're going to get sued or pursued by the Department of Justice. The only documentation I found actually required to be an ADA compliant seems to apply only for governmental agencies. Can you provide some clarity?
Well, that was true once upon a time when they were investigating under Section 508. Section 508 is a requirement for government agencies and people who receive money from the government. However, now that the Department of Justice has said that they understand the Americans with Disabilities Act to be applicable to the web, which means because of the way that we use the web these days, it is in fact a public space. And so if the ADA applies to the web, then that means if you are a public website, if you do business, you have to meet those requirements. Now, I'm not at the DOJ, I don't work for the government, but my understanding is that their investigation and prosecution process is very much complaint driven. So if you say you're a bank and you have a client who can't use your online banking, and that client contacts the DOJ, and it's very easy to lodge a complaint. Basically, you go to their site and say, here's where I had an ADA violation, and then the Department of Justice will investigate, and if they think there's cause for further action, they'll take it. But the preliminary investigation is to say, well, is this just a complaint because somebody doesn't know how to use their assistive technology, or does this really have basis? And I think also what they do is they contact the person who's being investigated or the company, and they say, here's the complaint, do you have a response? And maybe ask some questions about the development process or the alternatives for the person to get equal access. But the bottom line is the Department of Justice is saying equal access on the web is the same as equal access to your grocery store. Did that answer the question?
Yes, I didn't realize I was on mute. Thanks, Sharon. That was great. I think next question is from Donald. He was curious about the accessibility of content management platforms like WordPress, or I don't know if you had other kind of thoughts or feedback more generally kind of on the state of accessibility of different CMS platforms.
I love that you asked that question, because we concentrate so much on the WCAG guidelines, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that we forget that there are also authoring tool accessibility guidelines. And that's the next challenge, I think, is to get browsers to support accessibility and authoring tools also to not only create accessible content, but also to allow people with disabilities to use their platforms. Now, there's a very active web accessibility community in WordPress, and there's also one in Drupal and in Moodle. Other CMS, I think most commercial CMS, it's more problematic. Now, the ones that are learning management platforms have gotten increased pressure lately because exactly of the legal pressure and the lawsuits. So we're seeing a lot of activity there. It wouldn't quite be right for me to start recommending this one or that one. You've got my contact information if you wanted to contact me offline. If you have questions about a specific LMS, I can tell you my experience, but it's pretty dodgy right now. It's really not it's not consistent, and my advice to a lot of the people who are makers of those LMS and CMS systems is to start looking at the ATAG guidelines and to start making sure that they're conformant with those standards as well.
And what we could do is, Sharon, if you have any thoughts or resources around how to make sure that your WordPress or CMS installation is as accessible as possible, we can include that in the webinar recap that we'll send around.
Oh, sure. Tomorrow. Yeah, that's a good idea. Well, I can send you links to the people who are most active in that, Joe Dolson, and there's a big push in WordPress for accessibility. So
that's awesome. Next question, Leah asks, on the keyboard slide, you state that the keyboard focus should be clearly visible as mouse hover states. Can you explain it?
Well, you know how when you mouse over something, often it gets bigger or it changes color and it lets you know. Or if I mouse over a drop down or a mega menu, boom, it just pops out and fills up the screen. Often that does not happen with keyboard. So I'm tabbing through and it seems like nothing happens, nothing changes. Maybe I'll get a little default dotted line around it, which is the browser default. Sometimes people even turn that off, so you can't see where your focus is at all. And so it's really, and I can demonstrate, let's see, how would I do that? I could go, like here we are on the Nobility site, and if I tab through, see how the place where I've tabbed to is green and the menu drops, and then if I use the arrow key, I can arrow down and I can see where my focus is. Now if I tab, I keep moving through this top layer, and if I use the arrow key, I go down, but at every point I know where the focus is on the page. I don't have to guess, and I have very easy access back and forth through the different layers of the menu.
Awesome.
Did that answer the question?
I think so. Next question, Molly asks, is there any new information about ARIA implementation progress in browsers? How would you recommend advocating for better accessibility in web apps? I guess two parts to that. Like, or a couple of parts to that. Do you want to first also kind of explain for our audience more generally what ARIA is, for those who may not know?
Sure. ARIA is the Accessible Rich Internet Applications, and it was invented in a collaborative way. A lot of leadership there from IBM, where when the web became so dynamic, and it was very difficult for the assistive technology to keep up with the dynamic changing. When user activity would change what was being displayed or change your options, it was difficult for the assistive technology to keep up with that. So ARIA was invented as a direct line of communication to assistive technology. It said, this is an active region, this is changing. It defined regions of the page. I mentioned ARIA landmarks earlier. Right now, they're publishing an authoring ARIA author's guide, which I think is either in. I'm not sure what the state is. It's a draft. It's a public draft. We could go look at that. So the authoring guide is wonderful because it says, it takes you away from those technical specifications. It gives you some practical ways and some practical examples to apply ARIA principles and make sure that no matter how dynamic your interfaces are, that you don't leave the screen reader out of it, that you convey all the stuff that's going on to the assistive technologies. It's really quite a useful thing, because in that way you're not saying, oh, to be accessible you have to dumb down your applications. You're saying, well, now that you've made this whiz-bang application, here's a way to make it whiz-bang for the screen reader too, by giving them the ARIA information and allowing full access. The other part of the question was about apps, right?
Yes. And progress in terms of browser implementation, browsers recognizing.
Well, Molly asked the question then that is kind of is one of my pet peeves lately, because we do make this progress in creating ways for dynamic applications to communicate with assistive technologies, but then it can break down in how it's supported by the different browser makers. And I don't want to pick on anybody, but I will say that Firefox has the most robust support for ARIA that I know about, and there are there's just room for improvement in the same way that I said I think the authoring tool people should be looking at ATAG and trying to implement the ATAG guidelines. That's also true for browser makers. I think they should be implementing UAG more uniformly, more robustly, and give so that these things that exist that are good opportunities are fully realized in all the browsers.
Awesome. Next question. Chris asks, or I guess in his question asked about how he inherited a really intricate and custom website, and he's trying to start tackling accessibility and wondered how he should prioritize the different tasks that he's got in front of him. Like, what are there specific problems that are more universal that he can hit right away that will make the biggest possible effect the quickest?
Yeah, well, retrofitting is hell, and that's true for websites as well as buildings. When you try to retrofit for accessibility, an old building, it's clunky and hard. Accessibility works much better when it's thought about and part of the planning and part of the development, the whole development life cycle. But I understand that you are where you are and you've inherited this. I would prioritize with keyboard access, making sure that you have visible keyboard access to everything. That would be the number one. Obviously, images and having good, solid descriptions of buttons, links, anything, your images, your descriptive images certainly, but your functional images probably first. And forms. Make sure your forms are properly labeled, that your error messages are clear and actionable. So I think that's what that's how I would prioritize. The structural elements are really important too, and thinking about making sure that you've got good heading structure and using those regions, just describing the regions of the page accurately. But I think keyboards and forms are, because just think about the most interactive parts of the where you have the most interaction. Make sure that people understand what they're supposed to do, that they can get there from the keyboard. They know what they're supposed to do when they get there, and they have a way to recover if they've made a mistake.
Next question. Is there any type of certification for a website to show that they're indeed 508, or I guess just more generally compliant with web accessibility guidelines?
I think the NFB has a certification, but that's, that just says blind people can use your website. It's not really a 508 or and there are people, I think there are some certifications out there. I'm a little leery of that personally. That's just a personal approach because of the dynamic nature of the web. So I get a certification today, and then tomorrow I go do a bunch of changes and updates. What has happened then to the accessibility? Where's my baseline? How can I really be confident in that? So I'm a little leery of certifications. I think there are some, but I'm probably not the one to recommend them to you. I remember there used to be, remember Bobby? Is anybody as old as me and remembers the little British Bobby? And you would say, this website is Bobby certified, and your little British Bobby would have his thumbs up saying, yep, you did everything you're supposed to do. But I don't think I don't think Bobby's been around for a while.
Those were quite a long time ago, fun times. Neil asked, a lot of software is cloud-based now. Do these technologies have to conform to the same accessibility guidelines as a website?
Yes.
Awesome. Neil asked, so Eric previously had a question about the legal aspects of it. Neil asked, I'm based in the UK. I'm assuming there are different legal requirements. Could you send links so this can be researched further? Do you have any, so let's say generally, like we speak to very much an international audience, so I imagine a lot of you are not, or at least a good chunk of you are not based in the United States. Sharon, do you have any thoughts in terms of like non-US based, legal requirements around accessibility?
I'm gonna send you back to the WAY website because we have a page there about policy. It's an international page right now. We're in the process of updating it. I think it hasn't been updated for several years, and of course, policies and technology change so fast that that might have well been in the Pleistocene or whatever. So it's pretty old right now, but keep an eye on it because it's actively being updated, and it is a link to policies in different countries, and then supporting information for what it means. And it's really going to be a very nice and highly interactive resource when it's finished, because the idea there is to allow the community to keep it current, so that when policies are updated in the UK or wherever, that there's an opportunity for the community to enter the new information and the new resources. And by the way, the EO is really making a lot more of its resources community-based like that. We have an accessible UI components list. So if somebody has made an accessible widget, like I've made an accessible seat finder for an airplane, or I've made an accessible date picker, or whatever it might be, you can list that on the accessible UI components list on the WAY website, and the world will find it. So that's
great. Such a great resource.
That's the direction we're going in for the policy as well. As we update the policy, that we get the latest and most current and most useful information there.
Awesome. Last question. When should organizations submit a request to access works for usability testing? I'm assuming that after you have finished the easy checks, and then what are the costs for that?
Well, I think that that usability testing is something that people do at different times, depending on their own development life cycle. Some people do periodic usability testing just to kind of take the temperature of the website and not even thinking about disability, just usability, getting user input on a regular basis. So it's hard for me to say when you should do this. I think the cost is for an AccessWorks test is something like $75 a user. So, and you can specify, I want this assistive technology or that one, and that's all passed along to the people. Like I said, we're a nonprofit. It's a pass through so that people with disabilities have an opportunity to make money for the time they spend. But as to when you should do it, I think that's a really hard question without knowing more about where you are right now in development and maintenance. There's another resource I'm going to tell you about at the another new resource. We've been pretty busy at EOWG the last couple of years, and there's one called Planning and Managing Web Accessibility, and that's a fairly new resource as well, and it kind of talks about different ways to approach and integrate accessibility into your practice. So if you go to the WAY website and just search for Planning and Managing, you'll find the Planning and Managing Guide.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sharon. Unfortunately, that's all the time I have for questions. If anyone else has any other questions, please reach out to Sharon, or as I said, we will be sending around a recap of the webinar in addition to the video, a video of this entire presentation and the slides. So you should have that as a resource. But then also too, like if you have further questions, please reach out to Sharon directly. Thank you so much, Sharon. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. This was fantastic. And thank you all for coming to this webinar. Please stay tuned for additional webinars that we'll be promoting in the upcoming weeks and months. We hope you found this really useful. We will be sending out a survey shortly to all of you that attended so we can get your feedback. We want to make these as useful and helpful to everyone as possible, and so just really value that feedback. Thanks again. Cheers.
Thank you. It was great to be with you all. Thanks.